I live in a little place called Wimbledon in London. Anybody heard of Wimbledon? Yeah. We have a little yard game called tennis, yeah? And when I travel around the world, I say, oh, I'm from Wimbledon, we play tennis there. They say, do you play? I said, oh, no, not really. They say, you're just being humble, aren't you? But no, I generally don't play very much. And I live there with my wife, Esther, and we have 3 children. Reuben, who's 8 years old, Matilda, who's 11 years old, and Joseph, who's 13. And I love my kids. I travel a lot. I want to begin, if I may, before I read the scripture and say a couple of things and pray with you. Is that okay? Yes. But before I begin, I just want to tell you a little bit about me. It's always nice when you meet a stranger just to find out a little bit more about them beyond the biography. All that aside, I grew up in a very religious home. Anybody here grew up in a religious home? My mum was a religious churchgoer. She never missed a Sunday, morning and evening. My father, he was just as religious. Except his religion on a Sunday morning was washing his car. Every Sunday, without fail, he'd get out the bucket and the sponge and the chamois cloth and he'd wash his car. It's rather embarrassing because I never wash my car. I just drive it around. And as a young boy, I always resented the fact that I was forced to follow my parents' religion. I resented the fact that I was forced to follow my mother's religion and not my father's, because I'd have much rather stayed at home on a Sunday and washed the car rather than go to church. But that's how I grew up with my sister. In my teenage years, I remember receiving a telephone call from my father. And he said to me, son, she's gone. And we'd just been through a very painful few weeks. His mother had died. We'd had the wake. And we were living with the loss. And so when he phoned me as a teenager and said, she's gone, I said, yeah, Dad, I know she's gone. And he said, no, not my mum, your mum. She's left me. I was kind of, most people's parents argue a bit, don't they? But I just didn't see this coming. And I kind of finished the call with my dad, and I was a little bit I didn't know quite what was going on. So I immediately picked up the telephone to my mentor at church, an older gentleman than me who was part of the leadership of the church. We used to meet when I was at home with my family. We used to meet and read the Bible and pray together. He was always an encouragement to me. Well, some of us challenged me as well. We all need that, don't we? And I reached out to this gentleman. And I just chatted to him on the phone. And I just said, I've just had this really just shocking telephone call with my father. And I explained to him what had happened. And as I talked on the telephone, suddenly he went very quiet. And it was in that moment and the moments that followed that I discovered that my mum had left my dad, but she'd left him for my prayer partner. There was a great sense of, I was shocked that my mum had left, but I was just like I was hit with a train. This guy in my church who I saw as a mentor figure, who I prayed with, who I read the Bible with. My mum had left my dad for him. Now, I don't tell this story this morning to point the finger at my mum or my former prayer partner. He's not my prayer partner any longer. I hope you'll understand. But I tell it for another reason, you see, because for 5 years I couldn't speak to my mum. or my prayer partner. I was so angry. I was so hurt. I just felt this was wrong. They never apologized. They never showed any remorse. They were never sorry. And it made me just so, they were wrong. They wanted to just carry on in church and carry on with me as if nothing had happened. And it was painful. And I lived for 5 years not speaking a word to either of them. And one day, one day grace wins over, doesn't it? And I remember the Sunday evening. It was a dark, wet, it was England, Sunday evening. And I remember knocking on the door of a house that was my mum's house. I remember her coming to the door, and as she opened it, she burst into tears. She threw her arms around me, and she welcomed me. She took me inside. She made me my favourite sandwich. And we started to rebuild our relationship. And now, the 3 children I told you about, Reuben, Matilda, Joseph, now they call my former prayer partner Papa. They know that he's not my dad, but they call him Papa. Because I believe that grace always wins. And when I woke up yesterday morning, I travel the world preaching, and I have a little book, if you like, of sermons I give. I'd had an amazing supper with Pastor Bio on Friday evening, and I woke up Sunday morning with 2 words. And I knew I couldn't preach any of my normal talks. I knew that God was giving me something for you. And the 2 words were these: complicated relationships. I don't know if you have any complicated relationships. You may have a complicated relationship with somebody in this church. A person sat a couple of rows in front of you, or a couple of rows behind you, or you've deliberately sat at opposite sides of the church to make sure you don't catch each other in the eye. There may be somebody at work that you have a complicated relationship with, a colleague, a boss, somebody you manage, supplier that you have to deal with, but you don't really want to deal with them. You may have complicated relationships in your family, and every family is different. You may have experienced abuse. You may have experienced worse rejection and betrayal than I've talked about. But most people have complicated relationships. If you don't have complicated relationships, let me tell you that you are the exception, not the rule. Does anybody here not have any complicated relationships? Could you just give me a little signal? Pastor Bio? No one has put up their hands. You probably know that. We all live with complicated relationships. But I'm encouraged, you see, because when I read the Bible, every Bible character you read about had complicated relationships. As I wrestled with this word from God yesterday, I thought, where shall I speak from the Bible? I was spoilt for choice. There wasn't a book in the Bible that I couldn't turn to that didn't tell the story of a difficult relationship. Abraham lying that Sarah wasn't his wife. Jacob and Esau battling over the inheritance rights. Solomon and all his wives. Paul and Barnabas and John Mark. Wherever you turn, the Bible is full of awkward, difficult, complicated relationships. So my friends, be encouraged. Because our guide in life is full of awkward, complicated relationships. Stories of betrayal, of unfaithfulness, of jealousy. But the one place I finally landed on was the book of Genesis and the story of Joseph. We know the story of Joseph. I mean, what an incredible story. This young man who was favoured by his father. It doesn't always help to have favourites, does it, if you're a parent? And his siblings hated him. And that was a complicated relationship. And then one day, his father, instead of giving him a suit that was from just off the peg, he got him a designer suit made. Do you think that helps family relationships? No, his siblings hated him all the more. Was the father stupid? And then Joseph, he was a young man. Like most of us as young men, we're a bit arrogant. He had these dreams, and they were real dreams. And as you know in the story, they come to pass. But he had these dreams that his father and his brothers would bow down to him. And he told these dreams to his siblings just to enhance family relationships. What a big head. Hey, by the way, guys, I know you don't like me, but you're going to bow down to me. And you, Dad. So I could kind of understand it. His brothers began to plot and scheme. What can we do about this arrogant brother of ours? And they planned to kill him. And then Reuben, I've got a Joseph. Joseph is one of my favourite Bible characters, and my other son is called Reuben. Every Joseph needs a Reuben. Reuben persuaded them, let's not kill him. They put him in a well, they sold him to slavery, and they went back and told their father that he'd been killed. I mean, goodness me, complication after complication. And then Joseph experiences favour, and he ends up running the Pharaoh's household, and then the Pharaoh's wife accuses him of adultery, ends up in prison, falsely imprisoned. And the story goes on. We know the story well, but right at the end of the story is where I'd like to pick up. In Genesis chapter 50, verses 15 to 21, this is what the Bible tells us. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him?" You can imagine, can't you? Their father is dead. Joseph might have held himself back out of respect for his father. And now the father was gone and the brothers were in fear and trembling. What if Joseph was living with unforgiveness and now the father was gone? He was going to get his revenge. So they sent word to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father." When their message came to Joseph, he wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. There's a couple of things I want to say about complicated relationships before I'd love to pray with some of you. The first is this: the price of unforgiveness is more than we can afford. The price of unforgiveness is more than we can afford. Last year, I took my family to South Africa. We had an incredible time. And as part of the trip, we visited Robben Island, the place where Nelson Mandela was politically incarcerated for years. And we were humbled that one of the guides that showed us around the island was himself a former political prisoner. At the very end of the tour, he said, has anybody got any questions? There was one question that was burning in my heart. I said to him, do you still feel angry about what happened to you? And if not, why not? He said how when they were imprisoned, they wished harm. They wished sickness upon the prison guards. And when any of them were unwell, they celebrated. And he explained how one day Nelson Mandela said to him, harboring unforgiveness is like drinking poison and expecting your enemy to be hurt. My friends, there is only one person who suffers when we live with complicated relationships. There is only one person who suffers when we have anger inside us against somebody else. There is only one person who suffers when we live with unforgiveness. There is only one person who suffers when there are people in this church that you don't speak to or avoid. There is only one person who suffers when you allow relationships to become fragmented and damaged at work. There is only one person that suffers when you live with unforgiveness in your family. It's me. It's you. I remember years ago receiving an invitation to speak at a business conference. They said to me, Matt, will you speak to us on the subject of networking? Now, I don't know how you feel about networking. My insides cringe and crawl and squirm. You know, you go to those events, don't you? Most of us hate them. And you build up the courage to go and speak to somebody you don't know, and you're stood talking to them, and they keep on looking over your shoulder to see if somebody more important has walked into the room. Ever happened to you? Maybe it happens at church, I don't know. Or you're stood talking to somebody at one of these events and you think, wow, they're really interested in me. They're really interested in me. And then you realise they're asking you questions because they're trying to size you up to see if you could be helpful to them or not. And for as long as they think you can be helpful, they'll stick around. But the moment they think you can't be helpful, they'll be gone like a shot. I hate networking. By the time I spoke to the conference organiser and explained, by the time I'd finished, he was quite deflated. I think he wished he'd never bothered asking me. And I said to him, but I do believe in the power of relationships to grow people, to grow teams, to grow business and organisations and communities. He said, will you come and speak on that subject? I was cornered, I agreed. I didn't want to become known as the anti-networking guy. It's bad to be defined by what you're not, isn't it? I don't want to become the anti-networking guy. What do I call this? And I thought, well, relationships are a science because there isn't a person in this room who can't learn to do relationships better. They're an art form because they take a lifetime to master. You don't need to be married to know that. But relationships are science and art. And God gave me this word, relationology. The art and science and study of relationships. I ran to my computer. I Googled it. I couldn't find it. So I formed the company, trademarked the name, and bought the web domain. And I began a business. And now I work, and this week, in fact, I'm speaking at the Federal Reserve Bank in Washington, D.C. I'm talking to them about how they grow revenue by building powerful client relationships. Because the true currency of business, you see, is relationships, not money. You know, if you're hungry for opportunities in business, just ask yourself, what job market are you fishing in? Okay? Because the fact is this, that that 2/3 of jobs are never advertised. Did you know that? So if you're looking for a job or a contract or an opportunity, you might be fishing in the small pool of opportunities and jobs, the advertised ones. Because the majority of them are never advertised. Why? Because these jobs and these opportunities, these contracts, go to people already known by the employer. You see, relationships are how business works. Relationships is what creates opportunities in life. You see, and relationships, that's what drives our performance. Do you know the fastest, simplest, and easiest way to get anything done, whether it's in this church, your school, your hospital, your business, wherever it is you work, the fastest, simplest, and easiest way to get anything done is through a trusting relationship. It doesn't matter what procedures and protocols that your organisation has in place. The thing that drives personal performance are the relationships of trust you can build. Because instead of filling in a form, you can phone somebody and say, can you help me? That's how it works. And businesses grow because of these relationships. Because out of choice, people do business with people they know, people they like, people they trust. The true currency of business is relationships. So I spend my time with financial institutions around the world, helping people develop their careers, increase their performance, and grow their business through what? Building relationships. You see, if we live with unforgiveness in the workplace, if we live with complicated relationships, if we allow relationships that have gone wrong to continue, we forfeit the benefits of relationships. We forfeit the blessings that God provides through relationships. Opportunities won't come. Our performance will go down. Our business will not grow. But not only do relationships drive our careers and our business, but relationships impact our well-being. The longest longitudinal study in history is run by Harvard. It's called the Harvard Study of Adult Development. It's been running for 8 decades. They've followed a group of people through 80 years. The study now has its 4th director of studies. You may have heard of it. The 3rd director of studies was a professor called Greg Valiant. At the end of his time running the research, he summarized it with 3 words. Happiness is love. Because all the people that lived in love and harmonious relationships were happy. All the people who lived with unforgiveness, resentfulness, anger towards other people were unhappy. It's not rocket science, is it? But it's great when it comes from an institution like Harvard. The 4th director of studies was a gentleman called Professor Robert Welsinger. He concluded in fact, it's not concluded yet, but he summarized his study. And he said this, that the quality of relationships a person has at 50 years old determines the quality of their health at 80 years old. There is a direct correlation between the quality of our relationships and the quality of our health. There's a professor called Julian Holt Lunstead at Brigham Young University. She studied social relationships and mortality risk. Cut along, you can go and Google it, watch it on YouTube, read the papers. But she basically concludes that the biggest factor influencing your longevity of life isn't how often you go to the gym or what your diet is. And I'm not suggesting you don't go to the gym, my friends, or just live on burgers. But the most important factor for your longevity of life is what? Your social relationships. So, my friends, if you live with unforgiveness, you forfeit happiness, health, and longevity of life. I could tell you story upon story, case study upon case study. But I mention all this morning because this is the way that God has created the universe. You know, we read the psalmist, don't we? Isn't it good and nice when people live together in unity? Well, nice, good, they're a bit lightweight, really. What David is really saying is, when you live in relationships, strong relationships with other people, you experience shalom. You experience well-being. You experience good health, longevity of life. You experience success. But the moment we hold unforgiveness against someone else, we forfeit the divine blessings that come with good relationships. Why is it that at the heart of the gospel, at the very heart of the gospel, is a ministry of reconciliation between us and God and us and one another? It's incredible. The price of unforgiveness is more than we can afford. I can't afford to forfeit my happiness, my health, my longevity of life. I can't afford to forfeit opportunity, performance, and growth. A friend of mine grew up in Asia, and she used to talk about the monkeys and the trees and what a nuisance they were, particularly in restaurants. And so what they'd used to do, the locals would pick the coconuts and they'd drill a hole in them and they'd put a stone inside and they'd rehang them back in the tree. And when the wind blew, the monkeys would hear this noise in the coconuts. And they'd climb the trees, they'd put their paw inside the coconuts, grab the stone, but then they couldn't get the hand out of the coconut because it was now too big. And all they needed to do was let go. And they could withdraw their hand. But instead, they kept hold of the stone. Kept hold of the stone. And they were caught and trapped and taken away. My friends, when we hold unforgiveness towards another person, we're as stupid as the monkey. Because the only person that gets harmed is ourselves. When we hold unforgiveness, it's like drinking poison and expecting the other person to be harmed. For those 5 years, understandable years, I didn't talk to my mum. It was only me that was being harmed. And I think there needed to be a period of time when we didn't talk. Do you know what? My mum never said sorry. But grace wins over. If you are waiting for the other person to say sorry, you could be waiting a very long time. Don't let your happiness, your health, your longevity of life be dependent upon somebody else saying sorry. Christ died for us whilst we were still sinners. Christ gave his all for us before we'd ever turn to him. Let go of the stone. Let go of the bitterness. Let go of the anger. The price of unforgiveness is more than we can afford. The final thing I want to say is this: that God's purposes are bigger than us. God's purposes are bigger than us. You see, we have developed such an individualistic faith. And don't hear me wrong, I'm not against taking personal responsibility. We're all personally responsible for our decisions. But we've grown up asking ourselves the faith question, God, what is your purpose for our lives? What is your destiny for me? You notice it's all about me. It's all about you. It's all about us. But there is a thread of a very strong theme of theology in Scripture which isn't about the individual. It's about nations. God called a whole nation called Israel to follow him. To be blessed, not for self-indulgence and exclusive privilege, but he called them to be blessed, to be a blessing. He called them to live in such a holy way that other nations would be drawn, that they would be a light to the nations of the world. God is into cities. He spoke through the prophet Jeremiah to the people of Israel to seek the peace and prosperity of the city. Because if the city is blessed, you will be blessed. In the New Testament, we read about how Jesus transformed whole communities of lepers, outcasts of society, 10 lepers, all healed. Only one came back to say thank you, but he knew that, but he healed them all anyway. Jesus transforms communities. Jesus tells us to go and disciple nations. We just translate that into a group of individuals. It's not what Jesus said. Jesus said disciple nations, cultures, people groups. You see, throughout the whole of Scripture, there's a theme of nations, of cities, of communities, of the collective purposes of God. And when you read the story of Joseph, if you think it's about Joseph, you're mistaken. You see, the whole story of Joseph wasn't the point. God allowed what happened. In fact, he intended what happened. Why? The Bible says, for the saving of many lives. Because Joseph had a gift of interpreting dreams. So he interpreted the Pharaoh's dream to say, there's going to be 7 years of abundance and 7 years of famine. So during the 7 years of abundance, let's save 1/5 of all the harvest. So that during the 7 years of famine, there's enough. It's a good reason to save, but let's not get into money right now. And Joseph found himself as the prime minister of Egypt. And his father and brothers came and they were in famine. They had not saved up. The whole purpose of Joseph's journey was not Joseph. It was for the salvation of a nation called Israel. God's purposes are bigger than you and they're bigger than me. We so easily slip into an individualistic view of the world. And we just get obsessed with our complicated relationships. But you see, God is orchestrating. God is arranging. God is working out for the salvation of Houston. God is interested in the salvation of cities. God is interested in the salvation of nations. And when we begin to ask God, what is your purpose for my life in the context of your city and your nations, your purpose and your destiny suddenly comes to life in a new way. Suddenly there's a reason to reconcile broken relationships, to offer forgiveness to others. Because not only are you forfeiting your own well-being on your own success, but you are standing in the way of God's destiny for your city and for your nation and for your nations of the world. God's purposes are bigger than our purposes. God's ways are different to our ways. He sees things we don't. He understands things we don't. So my encouragement today, my friends, is to reconcile complicated relationships, not only so that you personally can be blessed, but so that God can bless the city of Houston and that God can bless the United States.